Hi, everybody. We weren't actually going to record anything this week. John's away, and we were going to take a break this week from our JSpaceCanada Policy Space. But with everything that's going on, actually, maybe a little bit of a change of pace, with the focus really being on Iran and the protests in Iran and how the diaspora is responding. I didn't want to wait until next week when John and I chat to kind of broach the topic or to talk about it a little bit more. And so, in John's absence, I have asked someone else to come join us who has many credentials to his name, but is above all a dear friend of mine. But I have asked Daniel Bral to join us today. Daniel Bral is a first generation Iranian-American-Jewish writer on American Jewry, Israel, and Peace. And he serves as the director of education for Project Shema, another organization that we are fans of here. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, my friend. It's good to be with you. I'm honored that you asked me to be in conversation with you guys. And I also just want to say it's important for me to thank you for even talking about this subject. Uh, you know, it's it's obviously, and I know we're going to get into this, but what's happening in Iran doesn't often get the attention that we would like, or it's being appropriated in really negative ways. So I just want to say thank you and your organization, JSpace, for actually giving it some time and attention.
Thank you, thank you. And in order to do that, let's turn over to you if you can share. And just, I think, just to give everyone some context too, in our policy space series, we often go into the kind of just the cold hard analysis. I think because we do have the treat of having Daniel here, who has so much personal connection and experience, we're going to go a little bit more into kind of I think the feelings and the more emotional side of what's happening and how you're reacting here in the diaspora. So, in order to do that, why don't you start just by sharing a little bit about your family and your background, how you came to the U.S. and anything else you want to share about that experience?
Yeah, I like to share about myself and my family by actually taking a couple steps back. So I'm sure, like many of us, many Jews, I come from a line of Jews who chose to proclaim their Jewishness openly, even in places where tolerance was never promised. So my grandfather, Musa, really embodied that courage. He was a pharmacist by trade, but became the sole Jewish member of parliament in pre-revolution Iran at the
Wow.
time because of restrictive quotas, serving as the representative to the entire Jewish community. And despite the burden of that responsibility, he refused to be constrained by the limits imposed on him because of his identity. And one of the first things that he did when he became a member of parliament, he changed the oath of office that required all members to take the oath on the Quran to permit every member to take the oath on their holy book of choice.
Wow.
And it was really the service of this small but mighty Iranian Jew that was rewarded by the Shah, Mohammad Reza, or the king, with the royal medal, which to me is why I take Muslim-Jewish coexistence personally, even though I'm not naive about its challenges, especially today. And I bring up his story not to obviously glamorize the Shah's regime, which is very checkered, but to illustrate how my grandfather and Jews more broadly were able to break through glass ceilings of a system that limited Jews only for that ceiling to really be reinstated when the revolution came knocking. And when it did, thankfully, my family was able to make it out before and during the revolution. There was obviously inklings that things were happening, things were going to change, and it wasn't going to bode well for the Jewish community there. My mom actually first left in 1976 by herself to come to America to study here, to go to college here, without even speaking a word of English, with no family or friends here, with the intention of going back to Iran. But obviously, she saw what was happening there and could never go back. So she didn't even get to say a proper goodbye to her home. And the same thing for my dad. He left Iran also when he was about 16 years old, went to the UK to study, lived there for about 16 years, and then ended up coming here. So that was kind of the journey for my entire family and how I ended up here as well.
Wow. And so, I mean, given all of that, that is a story that I think for many of us is probably there's elements that are very familiar in terms of leaving, fleeing, exile, diaspora. I think that's something that really does bond Jews in the diaspora, but I imagine that also for the Iranian Jewish diaspora, the experience, there are things that are different. We often talk about the Ashkenormative experience or the Ashkenazi diaspora. What's different about the Iranian Jewish diaspora that we might not know about that you can share with us?
Oh, this one is really important to me. I really appreciate this question, especially I'm gonna kind of take it in a maybe a little bit of a different direction because Ashkenormativity is um, something that is very important to me, not in terms of preserving it, but the role that it plays when we talk about the diversity of the Jewish community, and also what our Jewish institutions are doing to perpetuate this misconception about what Jewish identity is. And so, to say that, I think one thing that I would wish for our Jewish institutions to consider is how they default to the Ashkenazi experience. In other words, like treating Ashkenazi Jews as the end all be all of Jewish identity and history, right? And even coming down to the smallest of decisions, and this is a rhetorical question, but think about when you are going to a Jewish event, right? What stories are being told? Is it ever about Jews from Middle Eastern countries? Even down to the decision making of what is the food that is being served? It's often cold cuts or bagels and things like that. Where is the kebab? Can we ever have something like that? Um, so that has a domino effect, especially when it comes to helping non-Jews understand the Jewish diversity in terms of lived experience and history and trauma and identity. And I would say, you know, when it comes to our lived experience, we also often have more in common with our former Arab neighbors than we do with our Ashkenazi brothers and sisters. When we talk about, the differences in that for diaspora Jewry for Middle Eastern Jews versus non-Middle Eastern Jews, I think there's a connection, a cultural connection with our former Arab neighbors in terms of music, hospitality, food, the strong role of the matriarchy, things like that. Often the Ashkenazi experience centers around lived experience in Europe and the persecution that they face there, and that frames a lot of their identity and also relationship toward Israel. Same goes for us in terms of the centrality that Israel plays in our mind, maybe in a more hawkish way than our fellow Ashkenazis. Um, but that also doesn't get really factored into policy as much either, or decision making when thinking about the connection that Middle Eastern Jews have with former Arab neighbors. Are we understanding that importance, that connection, when considering who takes a central role in dialogue or relationship building or even trying to promote peace? So in many ways, I think there are differences that often get papered over.
It's really interesting actually that you say that specifically when talking about like peace processes and like diplomacy and the voices that are at the table because um it is interesting to hear that when you talk about like I don't know that I've ever really thought about that before that like the relationship that Iranian or more generally Middle Eastern Jews have with Arab neighbors and also potentially having that be kind of not as many generations removed can actually be a huge asset when talking about how we have those conversations from places of empathy and understanding one another, and there's probably a real untapped potential there.
For sure. And I think because there's a cultural fluency that's not often tapped into, and often we think about Mizrahi Jews and their relationship to their fellow Arab neighbors in a negative way. And of course, that negativity does exist because there's a feeling of being scorned, especially because this is still fresh and raw in terms of having to have left um, home countries, but that can also play a special or unique role when it comes to relationship building that we are currently struggling to forge at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that leads really nicely actually into the next question, which is about what's happening today and the protests. So, first to kind of set the scene, full internet blackout. There are conflicting reports, obviously, as a result of that, as to how many protesters have died thus far, but it's looking like the numbers is in the thousands. Um, at the hands of the protesters at the hands of the regime. We're seeing it get obviously, get covered on the news, but there are some restrictions or some things that are not getting through because of that, because of the internet blackout and because of the difficulty to communicate. So just curious, like, how are you personally feeling about what's going on? Did I miss anything? Is there anything that I should have also mentioned? And then how you're feeling about the protests, and also how the diaspora Iranian and maybe Iranian Jewish community is responding right now.
Yeah, it is a very emotional and sensitive moment for so many of us in the community, whether you're Persian in general or Persian Jewish. Um, I think, you know, first of all, you're absolutely correct in saying that the death count at the hands of the regime is now in the thousands, um, which is just devastating. You see videos of family members trying to identify their fellow family members in body bags and just shrieking in pain. And seeing that brings up the worst memories for so many of our family members about, the revolution and things of that nature. I think just like in the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, many of the Iranian Jewish communities just watching with bated breath, and just anxious about what's going to happen. I think a lot of us, myself included, refuse to get our hopes up, although there is a lot of optimism there just because this time around does feel like the tone of it is different. It is more steadfast than before. There is a different sense of energy and anger than we've seen in other protests in the past, including during the 12-day war. But with that being said, we also are not naive to the brutal tactics that the regime employs to crush any form of protest. So that's why I try to temper my expectations, although I am definitely optimistic that there will be change in the near future. I don't know what that change will look like, but from just a sentimental point of view, we are, I look at my elders and I observe what they're going through and just wishing for change for what is happening in their home country, that they feel, and we all feel, has been usurped by, you know, ideological theocratic extremists who are hell-bent on really making this country, a rich country, into their reductive image. And so I I'm optimistic. I'm not so I don't share really the same, I think, position as some of my fellow Iranian Jews when it comes to US intervention, just because I have no faith in Donald Trump making a smart tactical strategic decision. He has never proven he's capable of doing that. And so I believe that just like any other revolution or popular uprising, it has to be organic. It has to come from the streets and from the people themselves. And I worry that any foreign intervention can actually have a counterintuitive effect.
So let me ask you exactly about that, because uh, obviously, you talk. So first of all, what struck me is you talking about family members trying to identify other family members potentially in the dead in body bags, shrieking in fear and sadness and heartache, and it can't but not bring up memories for us of both the massacres of October 7th and seeing what happened in Israel at the hands of Hamas, and then over the past 2 years of the war with Gaza and seeing the complete devastation and destruction there, and just the amount of death, the amount of suffering, the amount of pain. Something that I think is maybe interesting about that, the differences of what we are seeing in the diaspora then versus now is a much more muted response in the diaspora. There's obviously many reasons for that in terms of what are current U.S. interventions or what is the current U.S. relationship. A war versus an uprising of the citizens. There are obviously a lot of reasons that things would be different, and I reject the idea that we should use the Iranian protests just as kind of a gotcha to point out some sort of hypocrisy. But I guess I'll let you speak to that further. I am curious to know, where do you think, when the discourse happens in the diaspora, especially as a Jew who's very involved on the Israel-Palestine issue, where do you see that? I'm going to guess that you're going to say that like every side is getting it a little bit wrong. And so I'm going to ask you to like dig into that a little bit more and tell us, if that's true, and then B, in what
Yeah,
ways.
I had to sit up for that. This one drives me crazy, and I think you may be referring to something I tweeted. I Look, I appreciate. I first want to say I appreciate the solidarity from many people in the community. I do want to distinguish between genuine solidarity and solidarity that is rooted in proving a political point. You use the word hypocrisy. I touched on something on Twitter, which is the Iran discourse is now being dominated by and hijacked by people who are engaging in a right-left proxy hypocrisy battle over Israel, right? So when you see tweets from, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but you see tweets from people on the left who can only speak about Iran by also invoking Israel or being an anti-imperialist or talking about the perceived influence of Israel or how Iran is Israel's enemy and so on and so forth. You could go down that rabbit hole. And the same holds true for so many people on the pro-Israel right who can only speak about a free Israel, I mean, a free Iran, Freudian slip. I do want to see a free Israel as well. A free Iran without invoking the quote unquote silence of the anti-Israel left. And it does to me, I find that very frustrating because it strips away the attention and agency that needs to be placed strictly on the people of Iran without proving a political point. And so to the detriment and the disservice of their bravery, a lot of the attention is being um, weaponized and stolen by people who are really just engaging in politics, right? You see a lot of people who cannot talk about Iran without pivoting or engaging in whataboutism. And of course, look, I'll be the first to admit I love pointing out a hypocrite. A lot of my advocacy is rooted in pointing out people who are engaging in bad faith. But I think there's always a time and place, and right now is not the time or the place.
So, okay, so I guess final question on that, and where I want to end it, because I think this is helpful for folks that are listening. There was just a protest over the weekend here in Vancouver, solidarity with protests in Iran, which is very heartening to see, especially because it's been raining nonstop here and it's disgusting outside. So when folks from the Jewish community or any kind of diaspora community, how do we want to show up in solidarity? Is it going to protest? Is there demands of like our government officials that we can be making? What would you, is it just more like educating ourselves more on the topic? What would be the best way to do that, as you're saying, that genuine solidarity?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think continuing to just put the spotlight on the bravery of the people and the the regime, and I say that because the regime is counting on fatigue to settle in by both the protesters and the international community who are drawing attention to the bravery of the protesters. So constant, continuous, steadfast engagement and highlighting what's happening there really goes a long way. And I would argue more in this instance and maybe other forms of uprisings elsewhere, just because of the brutality and the repressive tactics of the regime who are counting on fatigue to settle in. Um, I would also just encourage, as I said before, just centering what is happening there and not engaging in other politics or trying to make a broader political point about your own side in this moment.
That's really helpful. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate your time as well. We're gonna link to some of the pieces that you write because you're also an incredible writer, and I always love
Thank
reading
you.
what you've written. So we'll share some of that with the audience because I think they'll also be interested. And I just really appreciate you taking the time. And I too am hoping for a free Iran, and a real shift in the region after what we have seen and continue to see, especially in the past 2 years. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate you.
Thank you.